I have a pretty large family, but my fiancée Claire didn't. Her parents had both passed away some time ago, and she wasn't close to any of her aunts or uncles. So while planning our wedding, I ideally wanted as many of my relatives as possible to attend, but I also didn't want to make Claire feel uncomfortable. So in the end, we agreed I would cut my list down to 50 relatives and friends, and Claire invited about 20. Most of these were her work and old college friends and their partners. On the day of our wedding, apart from a handful of friends, I didn't know any of her guests. Most of them hadn't dressed up or looked like they made any effort, and they only seemed interested in the food and free bar. But there was a strange woman in a red dress who stood by herself and didn't seem to interact with anyone else. I meant to ask Claire about her, but after the ceremony, we were rushed around for photos and then got talking to the guests. It was hectic, so I forgot about the woman in the red dress and was focused on making sure Claire and our guests were happy and that everything went smoothly. Later on, while everyone was in good spirits and enjoying the celebration, I noticed the woman in the red dress standing next to the wedding cake. She was just standing there with a wine glass in her hand. It seemed odd she wasn't talking to anyone, but then I saw one of my guy friends headed her way to talk to her. Thinking he was trying to chat her up and not wanting to mess up his chances, I left them to it and went and danced with my new wife. When the song was finished and I could hear myself over the music, I asked Claire who the woman in the red dress was. Claire looked clueless, so I described the woman to her. She shook her head and told me that she thought that was one of my relatives. I thought back to the reception and the sit-down meal and couldn't remember seeing the woman in the red dress anywhere. If this was true, then she must have crashed our ceremony in the after-party. I decided I better try and find my buddy and warn him that he was hitting up a wedding crasher. I looked everywhere for him and the woman in the red dress, but I couldn't find them. Before I could search anymore, my cousin found me and announced it was time to cut the cake. As we were cutting it, I noticed the woman in red appear at the back of the room. She was staring straight at me with this permanent gaze. Something definitely wasn't right about the way she was staring at me. When we finished cutting the cake, I was too disturbed to take a bite and went to look for the red dress woman to confront her, but again, I couldn't find her anywhere. She didn't reappear that night, but neither did my friend. After some more drinks and all the hecticness of the day, I have to admit, I forgot about him. But he was an adult, so I figured he'd be fine. Then, in the middle of the night, Claire woke up and wouldn't stop vomiting. It was terrible. She just couldn't stop. It got so bad that she ended up being rushed to the hospital. Claire wasn't the only one who was sick. It seemed that almost all the guests were ill too. The hospital suspected food poisoning, and so after talking with the guests, we realized that the ones who hadn't eaten the cake didn't get sick and were all fine. I had a bad feeling about that woman in red, and remembering her lingering by the cake, I asked the hotel to show me the security footage. When I saw it, I couldn't believe it. The footage showed the woman take what looked like a syringe out of her purse and inject something into the cake. That crazy woman had poisoned us. After hearing this, I remembered my friend and how he hadn't been seen since he was with that woman. I got the hotel manager to check his room and they found him there, tied to the bed, unconscious, with all his stuff thrown across the room. She hadn't stolen his wallet or anything. She just trashed the place and left him like that. I don't know how or why she decided to crash our wedding, poison the cake and my friend, and do all that crazy stuff. My buddy didn't know either. He said he remembered her flirting with him and inviting herself to his room for a drink, but then after that, everything was blank. It makes me angry to know that someone would try to sabotage someone's special wedding day like that. I just don't know what would drive anyone to do something so absolutely deranged. I'd been dating this guy named Jason for about a month, and I thought it was leading to something serious. So when he invited me to be a +1 at his friend's wedding, I was flattered. I figured he wouldn't have invited me to meet all of his friends if he didn't see our relationship going somewhere. It was a garden wedding at this extravagant country club. There were about 30 guests, and first impressions were that the number of guests didn't match the venue, since the place was incredibly huge. The other guests weren't very talkative and they kept on staring at me. This made me feel really awkward, and I presumed because it was a small wedding, they thought I was a wedding crasher or something. I made sure to stick by Jason's side as much as possible so I wouldn't feel as judged by them. The ceremony was short and sweet. Then afterward, the guests wandered around outside while the pictures were taken. Jason was called by one of the bridesmaids in a purple dress to be in some pictures. The skies were getting gray and it looked like it was about to rain, so I asked one of the other guests where the reception was. She gave me a strange look and in this firm voice told me that it wasn't my time yet. I didn't know what she meant by that. All the guests were weird and I felt very uncomfortable. I ended up asking one of the employees where the reception was, and he directed me to a room at the top of the stairs and through a set of open double doors. The room itself was snug with one long table in it. Strangely, I didn't see a cake or anything of the sort. I walked around the table trying to find my name on the placeholders. I swear I checked every name on that table, but I couldn't find mine. In front of every place setting were intricately decorated masks, the kind you'd find at a masquerade ball. At this point, I gave up on trying to find my name and picked up one of the masks. I was turning it over in my hand when I heard footsteps behind me. One of the other guests, a man in his 40s, walked in and looked me up and down as if he was sizing me up, and in a serious tone told me that it wasn't my time yet. I was beginning to think Jason had never given a +1 to the wedding, and that's why everyone was being weird around me, and why I couldn't find my name anywhere. I left the room and went to look for Jason to question him about this. I looked all over the club, but I couldn't find him anywhere. However, I did find the bride talking to her father in one of the reception rooms. I listened in and overheard him telling her how they couldn't find her. The bride seemed upset about this. She told them that if they couldn't find her, then they'd have to use one of the bridesmaids instead. I snuck away and continued searching for Jason. I looked outside, only coming inside when it started raining. I didn't want to be late, so I hurried up the stairs and found the double doors now shut. Not wanting to barge in and walk in late to the reception and have everyone else stare at me, especially when I didn't know where I was sitting, I stayed there and tried to work out what to do. Then I heard a strange sound coming from behind the double doors. It sounded like a woman's scream. A scream that did not sound normal. It was the blood-curdling kind that only came from someone truly terrified. The doors swung open, almost causing me to fall over. As I staggered backward, I caught a glimpse into the room and saw all the guests wearing masks and sitting around the long table. There was something in the shape of a body covered in a purple cloth placed in the middle of the table, but it wasn't moving. I couldn't be exactly sure what it was, but I swear I caught a glimpse of blood seeping out from underneath the cloth. The man in the mask who'd opened the door quickly shut it behind him and looked down at me. He lifted his mask and I instantly recognized him. It was the same man who'd spoken to me earlier. He looked directly at me and in the same serious tone as before he said, "I told you, it wasn't your time." I left after that. No, I ran out after that. I thought Jason would have tried calling or messaging me, but I never heard from him again. I don't know for sure what happened at that wedding, but something definitely wasn't right. I always wondered that if I'd been in the room at the wrong time, then would I have ended up being the woman screaming? Was I the missing her the bride was on about? I just don't know what went on there, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. I used to work at a swanky luxury hotel as a waitress. They made most of their revenue from hosting weddings. I'm talking about the type of weddings that most people would need to sell their house to be able to afford. This particular wedding started out a lot like the rest. As the evening progressed and the guests got drunker, their behavior got worse. Inappropriate comments, overly friendly touching, that sort of thing. I removed myself from these situations as quickly as possible and bit my tongue to stop myself from saying anything. I was clearing all the empty glasses when I noticed one of the guests looking over at me, a man in a navy blue suit. When he saw that I noticed him, he made no attempts to look away from me and even raised his glass in my direction. I saw this guy looking at me a couple more times during the night. Once, as he was sitting at a table, he was just brazenly staring at me without trying to hide that he was doing it. Another time, while he was talking to the groom, I saw him say something, then they both looked over at me. They stared so intently, as if they were assessing me. It made me feel really uncomfortable. I tried telling myself they were simply rich, drunk jerks and that my shift would be over soon. I reminded myself about the nice wedding gratuity that all the staff would enjoy. The celebrations had come to an end and most of the guests left to go to their rooms. When I was in the middle of clearing a table, I saw that man come back into the banquet room and look around. He seemed relieved to have spotted me, and he came over and told me that one of the female guests was drunk outside her room and arguing with her husband and refusing to settle down. He said that all the other female guests had left, so he asked if I would go and try to calm her down. I didn't want to do this, but I also didn't want to annoy a deep-pocketed guest, so I ended up agreeing and said I'd be out in a minute. Not wanting to go out there alone, I asked my coworker if she'd go along with me. As we walked outside, the first thing I noticed was the man standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was sending a message on his phone. After seeing me, he smiled and put his phone away, but when he saw my coworker behind me, his smile faded and he looked really irritated. Before I'd even reached the bottom of the steps, he grabbed my arm and pulled me down them, and told me the guest was up ahead, but only I could go with him. I told him to let go of me, and he started pulling me along. My coworker ran off back inside. He managed to pull me around the corner. He kept saying the woman was just ahead and needed my help. He gripped me tightly and I couldn't get loose, even though I asked him to let go. The further he dragged me, the more it became apparent there was no female guest out there. I saw the headlights of a van coming towards us. It stopped right in front of us, and before I could figure out what was going on, the van door slid open and the man tried pushing me inside. Another pair of arms from an unseen person tried grabbing my waist. I kicked and lashed out and screamed at the very top of my lungs more than I'd ever done before. I honestly thought this was going to be the end and I was going to end up in the back of that van. But then I heard loud shouting behind me. It was my coworker along with my manager. Upon seeing them, the man and the unknown pair of arms let go of me and the van sped off. I was inconsolable and my manager got my coworker to take me into one of the employee lounge areas. He stayed and spoke to the man. Later on, when he came to see me, I asked if he'd called the police, and he told me that there had been a simple misunderstanding, and since no harm was done, they were going to let the matter slide. Flabbergasted by their reaction, I quit right then and there. That man had almost gotten me into that van, and I'm sure he would have managed to if I hadn't asked my coworker to go outside with me. I'm convinced that was his plan all evening. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the other people in the van was the groom. I saw them talking about me. I just don't know what they wanted to do with me, but just thinking about what could have been is horrifying. Worse still, my manager didn't call the police. I'm not sure if this is because he didn't want to upset his rich clients or tarnish the hotel's good name. Probably because of both. Either way, this means that the man and his friends are still out there somewhere. I really regret being too scared to call the police myself, as just thinking that they may have done this to someone else has given me countless restless nights.